The Lake's Lament. A peaceful camping trip turns into a fight for survival when whispers rise from the depths of Willow Lake. As shadows emerge and secrets surface, five friends must confront the sinister force that lurks beneath the water. Will you dare to face the lake's lament? Every summer, my friends and I would go camping at Willow Lake. It was tradition, a time to disconnect, roast marshmallows, and enjoy the great outdoors. But last summer was different. Last summer, something happened that none of us can explain. It was supposed to be our last hurrah before adulthood pulled us in different directions. There were five of us: me, my best friend Ryan, his girlfriend Emma, and our friends Nate and Claire. We'd been camping at Willow Lake since high school, but we'd never stayed as close to the water as we did that year. That was our first mistake. The first night was peaceful. The lake was calm, the water reflecting the moonlight like a sheet of glass. But around midnight, Claire woke us up, saying she heard something splashing in the water. When we shined our flashlights, the surface of the lake was perfectly still. "Probably just a fish," Ryan said, but Claire wasn't convinced. "I saw something," she insisted. "Something big." The next day, Nate found something strange near the shore, an old necklace, half buried in the mud. It looked handmade, with a stone pendant carved into the shape of an eye. That night, the whispers started, faint at first, like the sound of wind through the trees. But as the night went on, they grew louder, coming from the direction of the lake. Emma swore she heard someone calling her name. On the third day, we decided to leave, but every path back to the main road seemed to loop back to the campsite. No matter which direction we went, we always ended up back at Willow Lake. That night, Ryan disappeared. We found his flashlight near the shore, the beam pointing toward the water. As we called for him, the lake began to ripple, and a shadowy figure rose from the depths, a figure that looked exactly like Ryan. Desperate for answers, we confronted the lake. Claire tossed the necklace back into the water, shouting for it to let us go. The water churned violently, and the whispers turned into a deafening roar. The shadowy figure of Ryan emerged again, but this time it wasn't alone. Other shapes surfaced, dozens of them, their faces pale and lifeless. They began to wade toward us, their movements slow but purposeful. We ran. Somehow, we found a path that led us away from the lake, but when we reached the road, Ryan wasn't with us. The last thing I saw was his shadow, standing at the edge of the water, waving. We never went back to Willow Lake, but sometimes I dream about it. In my dreams, I see Ryan, standing in the middle of the lake, calling for me to join him. The Forgotten Village. An abandoned village hidden in the mountains reveals a sinister history, trapping a group of explorers in its ghostly grip. As whispers fill the air and shadowy watchers close in, the group faces a harrowing fight for survival. Will they make it out, or will Evershade claim them as its own? My friends and I love urban exploring. Old factories, abandoned hospitals, you name it. We've probably been there. But last month, we found something different. Something we should have left alone. It started when my friend Sam found a map of a forgotten village while digging through an old library archive. The village, called Evershade, was supposedly abandoned in the 1920s after a series of mysterious disappearances. No one knew why it was erased from maps, but Sam was determined to find out. There were five of us on the trip: me, Sam, his girlfriend Mia, our tech guy Eric, and my younger sister, Liv. We packed our gear and drove into the mountains, eager to uncover the secrets of Evershade. We should have turned back the moment we arrived. Evershade was like a snapshot frozen in time. The houses were still standing, though overgrown with ivy and moss. The streets were eerily empty, and a strange stillness hung in the air, as if the village itself were holding its breath. The first thing we noticed was the silence. No birds, no wind, not even the rustle of leaves. It was so quiet, I could hear my own heartbeat. Sam led us to what looked like the town square, where a crumbling fountain stood in the center. That's when we found the first sign of trouble: a freshly carved message on the stone base of the fountain that read, "Turn back." As we explored, things got weirder. Mia swore she saw someone watching us from one of the houses, but when we checked, it was empty. Liv found a diary in one of the homes, filled with frantic entries about the Watchers and warnings to stay inside after dark. The sun was setting, and Sam wanted to camp in the village overnight. Liv and I protested, but Sam was adamant. "This is our only chance to document everything," he said. Reluctantly, we agreed. That night, we heard footsteps outside our tents, slow, deliberate, and too heavy to belong to an animal. Eric set up his camera, but every time we reviewed the footage, it was blank, just static. Around 2 a.m., Mia screamed. She said she saw a figure standing at the edge of the firelight, its face pale and featureless. When we shined our flashlights, there was nothing there. The next morning, we found footprints circling our campsite, bare feet, but much larger than any of ours. The village felt even more oppressive in the daylight, the houses seeming to lean closer, their windows dark and menacing. We decided to leave, but the path we'd taken to the village was gone, replaced by dense forest. No matter which direction we walked, we ended up back in the square. That's when we realized we weren't alone. Shadows moved between the houses, and whispering voices filled the air. "They don't want us to leave," Liv said, her voice shaking. Desperate, we ran. The watchers followed, their pale faces emerging from the darkness. They moved silently but swiftly, always just out of reach. In the end, it was Mia who found the way out. She spotted a break in the trees and led us through. When we stumbled back onto the main road, the village was gone. We've tried to find Evershade again, but it's as if it never existed. Sam has been obsessed with going back, but the rest of us refuse. At night, I still hear the whispers and see pale faces in my dreams. Evershade didn't let us leave unmarked. I'm just waiting to see what it wants from us. The mirror's curse, a family heirloom, becomes a haunting presence, its reflective surface hiding more than just a likeness. Shadows move, whispers echo, and terrifying truths emerge as the new owner fights to escape its grip. Will you dare to face your own reflection after this chilling tale? For as long as I can remember, my grandmother's antique mirror has been the centerpiece of her home. It's massive, 7 feet tall, with an ornate gold frame and a reflective surface, so clear it feels like stepping into another world. She used to tell me and my brother, Ethan, that it was a family heirloom, passed down through generations. When she passed away last month, I inherited the mirror. At first, I was hesitant to take it. Something about it always gave me the creeps, but my mom insisted it was tradition. So I brought it home and hung it in the hallway. That's when things started to change. The first time I noticed something strange, I chalked it up to exhaustion. I was walking past the mirror late at night when I saw a shadow move across its surface. There was no one else in the house, and the lights were off, but the shadow was unmistakable, tall, humanoid, and deliberate. I turned on every light in the house and spent the night in the living room with the TV blaring. Ethan laughed when I told him about it the next day, saying I was just spooked from being alone. But the shadow wasn't the last thing I saw. Over the next few days, the mirror started playing tricks on me. I'd see things in the reflection that weren't there, flickers of movement, flashes of light. Once, I saw my own reflection blink when I hadn't. The worst was when I saw Ethan standing behind me in the hallway. I turned around to greet him, but the hallway was empty. When I looked back at the mirror, his reflection was still there, staring at me. "Very funny," I texted him, but he swore he wasn't at my house. It wasn't long before the whispers started. At first, they were faint, barely audible, like a distant conversation, but they grew louder, more insistent, and distinctly wrong. The voices spoke in languages I didn't understand, their tones urgent and angry. One night, I pressed my ear to the mirror, trying to make sense of the words. That's when I heard my name, spoken clearly and deliberately. I stumbled backward, my heart pounding, as the reflection rippled like water. Desperate for answers, I started researching the mirror's origins. My grandmother had always been vague about where it came from, but I found an old photograph of her as a child standing in front of it. The same shadowy figure I'd seen was faintly visible in the glass. I called my mom, who reluctantly admitted the mirror had a reputation in the family. "Your great-grandmother claimed it could trap spirits," she said. "That's why it stayed in one house for so long. No one wanted to take it. I demanded to know why she'd given it to me, but she only said, 'You're strong enough to handle it.'" Things escalated quickly after that. The whispers turned into screams, and the shadow appeared more often, always closer to the surface of the glass. One night, I woke up to find the mirror moved from the hallway to my bedroom, though I hadn't touched it. The final straw came when I saw Ethan in the reflection again. Only this time, he was screaming silently, pounding on the glass as if trying to escape. His face was pale, his eyes wide with terror. I knew then that the mirror had to go. My mom told me the only way to get rid of the mirror safely was to return it to the house where it had been kept for generations. She gave me specific instructions: cover it with a black cloth, drive it there without stopping, and leave it in the attic. I followed her advice, but the entire drive I felt like I was being watched. The car filled with whispers, and at one point, the cloth slipped, revealing the shadow figure staring at me from the back seat. When I finally reached the house, I ran inside with the mirror and slammed the attic door shut behind me. The mirror is gone, but I still feel its presence. My reflections don't always match my movements, and sometimes when I pass by a window, I catch a glimpse of the shadow. Ethan refuses to come over anymore, saying he feels off whenever he's in my house. I can't help but wonder, did I really get rid of it? Or has the curse followed me? The house at the edge of the field. When a curious new homeowner investigates the abandoned house next door, she uncovers a chilling mystery involving a ghostly girl, a haunted lantern, and a dark secret buried in the past. Will she escape the house's grip, or is she already trapped? Dare to find out. When I moved to the countryside for a quieter life, I didn't expect to find myself living next to a mystery. The house at the edge of the field, an old, crumbling Victorian manor, had been abandoned for years. Locals warned me to stay away, saying the place was cursed. At first, I ignored the rumors, but over the past few weeks, strange things have been happening, and now I can't ignore them any longer. The first time I noticed something odd, it was just after sunset. I was sitting on my porch, enjoying the cool evening breeze, when I saw a light flicker in one of the manor's upstairs windows. It was faint, like the glow of a candle. I convinced myself it was a trick of the light, but the next night, the same thing happened. A single flickering glow in the same window, as if someone were pacing back and forth with a lantern. A week later, I saw the shadow. It was broad-shouldered and tall, moving past the window as the light flickered. I called my neighbor, Mr. Greer, who had lived in the area his whole life. "You saw the lantern?" he asked, his voice grim. "That house has been empty for 30 years. Don't go near it." When I pressed him for more, he simply muttered, "Some places are better left alone." One morning, I found a piece of paper on my doorstep. It was a child's drawing, crudely sketched with waxy crayon. The picture showed the manor, with a dark figure standing in one of the upstairs windows. At the bottom, scrawled in shaky handwriting, were the words, "I don't know who left the drawing, but that night I heard the first knock." It started around midnight, a soft, rhythmic knock on my front door. I peeked through the curtains, but no one was there. The knocking stopped after a few minutes, but it returned the next night, louder this time. On the third night, I flung the door open, only to find a small, muddy footprint on the porch. The knocking stopped, but now I hear it in my dreams. I couldn't ignore the house any longer. Armed with a flashlight, I crossed the field and pushed open the creaking front door. Inside, the air was cold and stale, and the faint scent of mildew hung in the air. The floorboards groaned as I moved through the house. The walls were lined with faded wallpaper, and the furniture was covered in thick layers of dust. Upstairs, I found the room with the lantern. The air was colder there, and I swear I could hear faint whispers. On the windowsill was another child's drawing, this one of a girl in a white dress standing in the field. The words beneath read, "She waits for you." That night, I saw her. A young girl in a white dress, standing at the edge of the field. Her hair was dark and matted, and her eyes seemed to glow faintly in the moonlight. She didn't move, but I felt her watching me. When I tried to approach, she vanished into the mist. The next time I visited the manor, I found an old journal tucked away in the basement. It belonged to a man named Edwin Harker, the last known owner of the house. His entries spoke of a young girl who had died on the property, a servant's child who drowned in the well. According to the journal, her spirit haunted the house, searching for her mother. The lantern in the window was a signal, a way to guide her home. But the last entry warned, "Do not light the lantern. She is not the only one who waits. Following the journal's clues, I found the well at the back of the property. The stone was covered in moss, and the rope that once held the bucket had rotted away. As I leaned closer, I thought I heard faint sobbing coming from the darkness below. I dropped a rock into the well and listened. No sound came back. The night after I visited the well, the knocking returned, louder, more insistent. This time, it wasn't just at the front door. It was at the windows, the back door, even the walls. The air inside my house grew icy, and the whispers I'd heard in the manor surrounded me. Then, through the front window, I saw the girl again. She was standing in my yard, holding the lantern. The glow illuminated her face, which was pale and gaunt. She mouthed 2 words, "Follow me." I don't remember much after that. I woke up in my bed the next morning, my head pounding. The knocking has stopped, but the girl still appears in my dreams, standing by the well and holding the lantern. I've thought about leaving, but I can't bring myself to abandon the house. Something keeps pulling me back, whispering that my part in the story isn't over yet. The door in the woods. A mysterious door in the forest leads to a chilling world where shadows hunt and escape is not guaranteed. When a group of friends stumbles into the unknown, they must fight to survive the horrors on the other side. Would you dare to open the door? When my friends and I stumbled upon the door, it felt like we'd found a piece of another world. We were hiking in the woods behind my grandparents' cabin, an area I'd explored 100 times before. But this time, something was different. The door was standing upright in the middle of a clearing, completely out of place. It was made of dark wood, weathered but sturdy, with a brass handle that gleamed as if someone had polished it. There was no frame, no wall, nothing to explain why it was there. And of course, we couldn't resist opening it. That was our biggest mistake. When we turned the handle, the door creaked open to reveal darkness. Not the kind of darkness you find in a basement or at night, but an absolute void, like staring into the deepest part of space. We tossed a rock inside and waited. It didn't make a sound. "Cool," my friend Jake said. "Let's go in." The first step through the door felt like stepping into ice water. The air was cold and heavy, and the forest on the other side was eerily silent. The trees were gnarled and twisted, their branches reaching toward the ground like claws. As we walked further, we realized the forest wasn't empty. Shadows moved between the trees, shadows that didn't belong to us. We found strange symbols carved into the trees, glowing faintly in the dim light. Jake tried to touch one, but the moment his fingers brushed the bark, the forest seemed to shudder. A low, guttural growl echoed from somewhere deep within the woods. The shadows became bolder, circling us and darting closer with every step. When one of them lunged at Sarah, the youngest in our group, she screamed and fell to the ground. Her arm was slashed open, though we didn't see what did it. We turned and ran, but the door was gone. The clearing we'd come through had vanished, replaced by an endless stretch of trees. After hours of wandering, we found the door again. But this time, it wasn't alone. A figure stood in front of it, tall, skeletal, and draped in tattered black robes. Its face was hidden, but its eyes glowed like embers. It didn't speak, but we understood its warning. We weren't supposed to be here. We made it through the door just as the shadows closed in. The moment we stepped back into our world, the door slammed shut behind us and vanished. We've tried to find it again, but the clearing is gone. The woods seem normal now, but sometimes, when the wind blows just right, I hear the growls. The vanishing train. Step aboard a train ride that derails into the unknown, where time stands still and reality twists into darkness. Haunted by a spectral conductor and vanishing passengers, this journey takes you to a station that doesn't exist and a fate that can't be escaped. Will you brave the ride, or will you get off before it's too late? My name is Tom, and I've been a train conductor for the last 6 years. I've always loved the quiet rhythm of the tracks and the peace of traveling through the countryside at night. But something happened last month that I can't explain, and it's left me questioning everything I know about the job and reality itself. It was an overnight shift on the route from Chesterfield to Maple Hollow. The route is known for being uneventful, a straight shot through mostly farmland and forest. That night, we had maybe 6 passengers, all quietly reading or sleeping. The train glided smoothly along the rails, the hum of the engine lulling even me into a trance. Then, just after midnight, everything changed. The first sign of trouble came when the train began to slow down for no reason. I checked the controls. Everything was fine. But the brakes had engaged on their own, bringing us to a full stop in the middle of nowhere. Outside, the landscape was shrouded in fog so thick I couldn't see more than a few feet beyond the tracks. I radioed the dispatcher, but the line was filled with static. My assistant Carl shrugged. "Maybe it's just the fog messing with the system," he suggested. Reluctantly, I agreed and reset the controls. The train started up again, but the route was different. I didn't recognize the scenery anymore. Instead of farmland, we were surrounded by dense, gnarled trees that seemed to close in on us. The passengers began to notice something was wrong. An older man approached me, his face pale. "This isn't the right route," he said. "I've taken this train dozens of times. Where are we?" I didn't have an answer. "Please return to your seat," I said, trying to sound calm. "We're sorting it out." But the unease was spreading. A young woman near the back of the car began sobbing quietly, and an elderly couple whispered frantically to each other. Carl tried to reassure them, but even he looked unnerved. As Carl and I walked through the train, checking on passengers, we noticed something impossible. A new car had appeared at the end of the train. "I swear there were only 6 cars when we started," Carl whispered, his face pale. Cautiously, we stepped into the car. It was empty, filled with rows of dusty, tattered seats. The air smelled of mildew and something else, something metallic and sharp. At the far end of the car, a figure stood, its back to us. "Hey!" Carl called out, but the figure didn't move. When we approached, it vanished. The strangest part of that night was the clocks. Every time I checked my watch, it read 12:15. The passengers' phones and watches showed the same thing. Midnight had come, and it wasn't moving forward. At 12:15 sharp, the lights flickered, and a chilling sound echoed through the train, a low, mournful whistle that didn't belong to our engine. The fog outside grew thicker, and shadows began to move between the trees. Carl and I decided to stop the train and investigate the tracks. As we stepped outside, the air was frigid, far colder than it should have been. The fog swirled around us, and the trees seemed to lean closer, their branches clawing at the sky. That's when we saw him, a man in an old-fashioned conductor's uniform, standing on the tracks. His face was pale, his eyes sunken, and his mouth twisted into a grim smile. "This is my route now," he said in a voice like grinding metal. Carl and I bolted back onto the train, but the figure followed, appearing in different windows as we tried to escape. The train eventually came to a screeching halt at a station that shouldn't have existed. It was old, decrepit, and covered in ivy. The passengers refused to leave, insisting it wasn't safe. But the doors opened on their own, and a cold wind swept through the car. One by one, the passengers disappeared. Some stepped off the train and faded into the mist. Others simply vanished from their seats when we weren't looking. Carl and I were the last ones left. As the fog closed in, I heard the whistle again, closer this time. Then everything went black. When I woke up, I was back on the original route, the train moving smoothly along the tracks. The passengers were gone, and so was Carl. The dispatcher claimed there had been no interruptions, no delays, and no record of Carl ever being on the train. I quit the job the next day, but I can't stop thinking about that night. Somewhere out there, I believe that train is still running, trapped in an endless midnight. Will you dare to board it? The room that wasn't there. What starts as a simple home renovation turns into a nightmare when an unexplained room is discovered. With a cursed mirror, a shadowy history, and eerie reflections, this tale will leave you questioning what lies behind the walls. Are you brave enough to enter? It was just supposed to be a simple home renovation. My wife, Julia, and I had bought an old Victorian house last year, determined to restore it to its former glory. The place was a fixer-upper, with creaky floors, faded wallpaper, and a leaky roof. But it had character, and we were excited to make it our dream home. Then we discovered the room. A room that wasn't on the blueprints, that no one had ever mentioned. A room that once opened, changed everything. It started when we were tearing down a wall in the dining room to expand the space. As the plaster crumbled, we noticed something odd, a doorframe hidden behind the wall. Did you know there was a room here? Julia asked, brushing the dust off her hands. I shook my head. It's not on any of the plans. Curious, we cleared the rest of the debris to reveal an old wooden door. The handle was cold to the touch, and the wood was carved with strange symbols. Nothing we recognized, but enough to give us pause. When we opened the door, the first thing that hit us was the smell. Damp, musty, with a faint metallic tang. The room was small, no more than 10 feet by 10 feet, and completely empty, except for a single chair in the center and a large mirror hanging on the opposite wall. The mirror wasn't dusty like the rest of the room. It gleamed, its surface flawless and almost hypnotic. The frame was ornate, covered in carvings similar to the ones on the door. Creepy, Julia muttered, stepping back. It wasn't until later that I noticed the mirror's reflection was wrong. At first, it was subtle, small movements that didn't match ours. Then one night, I walked past the room and saw Julia standing in front of the mirror, staring into it. Julia, I called softly. She didn't respond. I stepped closer and saw that her reflection wasn't moving. It just stood there, staring back at her with unblinking eyes. When I touched her shoulder, she snapped out of it, but she didn't remember being in the room. Over the next few weeks, Julia became withdrawn. She'd disappear into the room at odd hours, claiming she was just checking on something. I caught her talking to herself once, though she denied it. I tried locking the door, but somehow it was always open the next morning. One night, I woke up to find her sitting in the chair in the room, the mirror's surface rippling like water. Her reflection turned to look at me and smiled, something Julia hadn't done in days. Desperate for answers, I began researching the house's history. It turned out the original owner, a man named Elias Grayson, was an occultist. Rumors swirled about his experiments with summoning spirits and trapping them in mirrors. The house had passed through several owners since then, many of whom reported strange occurrences, disappearances, strange illnesses, and in one case, a murder-suicide. One night, I decided to confront whatever was in the mirror. Armed with a hammer, I stormed into the room and smashed the glass. The mirror shattered into 1,000 pieces, but instead of falling to the floor, the shards hovered in the air, spinning violently. A voice filled the room, deep and guttural. "You shouldn't have done that." Then everything went dark. When I woke up, the room was gone. The wall we'd torn down was intact, as if we'd never opened the door. Julia doesn't remember anything about the room or the mirror, but she's been distant ever since, her eyes haunted by something she can't explain. Sometimes, late at night, I hear whispers coming from the wall. I try to ignore them, but I can't help wondering, did I really destroy the mirror? Or did I just set something free? The Whispering Cabin. Dare to follow a family as they reunite in a secluded cabin left to the eldest sibling. Nostalgia turns into horror when the walls begin to whisper. The shadows come alive, and the eldest brother unravels a sinister truth. What lurks within the cabin may have always been there, watching, waiting. Do you have the courage to uncover its secrets? Hi everyone. I'm in the middle of a situation that I can't shake off, and honestly, I'm wondering if I'm losing it or if there's some legitimacy to my concerns. My family has always had a history of weird feuds and dramatic disagreements, but this time, things feel different. Sinister, even. Here's the setup. My older brother, Jonah, inherited a cabin in the woods after our grandmother passed away earlier this year. This cabin was where she used to take us for summer trips when we were kids. It's beautiful, but secluded, surrounded by tall pines and nestled by a misty lake. Jonah always loved the place, so no one was surprised when she left it to him. What surprised everyone was when Jonah invited me and our 2 younger siblings, Elle and Mason, to spend a week there together in November. Jonah, being the introvert of the family, rarely initiated any plans, let alone week-long ones. Still, it felt like a nostalgic gesture, and we all agreed to go. But from the moment we arrived, something felt off. The drive to the cabin was uneventful. Jonah had sent us detailed directions, including warnings about spotty GPS signals. When Mason, Elle, and I pulled up, Jonah was already there, looking like he'd been camping out for a week. His beard was unkempt, and his eyes had this glassy, hollow look. He waved as we parked, but didn't come out to greet us. "Wow, he's really going for the rugged woodsman vibe," Elle joked nervously as we grabbed our bags. Inside, the cabin smelled faintly of pine and something else. Something metallic, maybe? Jonah had already started a fire in the fireplace, and the warmth was welcoming despite the creeping unease I felt. The layout was exactly as I remembered: a cozy living room, a small but functional kitchen, and 2 bedrooms downstairs, with a loft that had a couple of beds upstairs. Jonah had claimed the master bedroom, leaving the rest of us to figure out our sleeping arrangements. The first night seemed normal enough, at least until it wasn't. After dinner, we sat around the fireplace and shared stories about our childhood. Mason brought up the infamous lake incident, where Jonah had pushed him into the freezing water as a prank. Jonah laughed, but it sounded forced. He quickly changed the subject. Later, as we were settling into bed, I heard whispers. At first, I thought it was Mason and Elle talking in the loft, but when I got up to check, they were both asleep. The whispers weren't loud, more like the soft hum of wind passing through the cracks. Still, it was unsettling. I convinced myself it was the cabin creaking or my imagination and went back to bed. The next morning, Jonah was up early, chopping wood outside. He looked exhausted, like he hadn't slept at all. Over breakfast, Elle asked him if he was okay. "Fine," he muttered, barely looking up from his coffee. The day was overcast, but we decided to hike the old trail behind the cabin. Jonah didn't come with us, saying he had things to take care of. During the hike, Mason found strange carvings on some of the trees, symbols we couldn't recognize. Elle took pictures to look them up later, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we shouldn't have touched them. When we got back, Jonah was in the kitchen, staring out the window. He didn't say anything as we walked in, but I noticed his jaw was tight, his knuckles white against the counter. That night, the whispers returned, but this time, they were louder. They seemed to come from the walls, circling the room like a creeping fog. I tried to ignore them, but they were relentless. Mason came down from the loft at one point, saying he heard them too. "Do you think it's some kind of animal?" he asked. "I don't know," I said, but deep down, I was sure it wasn't. Then, out of nowhere, we heard a loud thud. It came from Jonah's room. Mason and I exchanged a glance before cautiously approaching the door. Jonah was inside, sitting on the floor with his back to the door, rocking slightly. His head was tilted, as if he was listening to something. "Jonah?" I said hesitantly. He didn't respond. By the third day, the cabin felt suffocating. Elle was anxious, Mason was jumpy, and Jonah was almost completely withdrawn. He barely spoke, and when he did, his words didn't make sense. "They're here," he said at one point, staring into the fire. "They've always been here." "Who's here?" Elle asked, but he didn't answer. We decided to cut the trip short, but when we told Jonah, he got agitated. "You can't leave," he said sharply. "Not yet. It's not safe." That night, the whispers turned into voices. They were loud, insistent, and angry. The fire in the living room flickered violently, casting grotesque shadows on the walls. At one point, the lights went out completely, plunging us into darkness. In the pitch black, Jonah began speaking in a voice that wasn't his own. It was deeper, guttural, and filled with malice. "You shouldn't have come back," the voice said. "This is our place." Elle screamed. Mason grabbed the flashlight, fumbling to turn it on. When he did, the beam illuminated Jonah's face. It wasn't his face anymore. His eyes were black, his mouth twisted into a horrifying grin. The next few moments were a blur. We ran out of the cabin, leaving everything behind. We piled into the car and sped off, not looking back. It's been 2 weeks since we left the cabin. Jonah hasn't returned any of our calls or texts. When I drove back with Mason to check on him, the cabin was empty. His car was gone, and the place looked abandoned. But the strangest part? The pictures Elle took of the carvings. They're gone. Every single one of them, wiped from her phone as if they never existed. So, am I the jerk for feeling like this is more than just Jonah losing his mind? Should I have done something differently, or was leaving the right choice? I can't shake the feeling that whatever was in that cabin isn't done with us yet. The forgotten reunion. An innocent family reunion in an old farmhouse takes a chilling turn when strange photographs, locked doors, and a haunting presence reveal the dark history of the property. As the walls groan and the shadows deepen, the family realizes they are not alone. Will they escape the house's sinister grip, or will its secrets claim them forever? Dare to listen and find out. It started with an innocent group text. My cousin Rachel sent out a message in late October suggesting a family reunion at my uncle's old farmhouse. She and her husband had recently inherited the property after my uncle passed away, and she thought it would be a great place to bring everyone together before the holidays. The thing is, none of us had been to that farmhouse in years. Growing up, my siblings and I always felt uneasy there. Something about the place never sat right with me. Maybe it was the way the woods seemed darker near the property, or how the house creaked and groaned even when the wind was still. But Rachel was insistent, and before I knew it, the whole family was on board. So last weekend, I, my sister Kara, my cousin Andrew, and a handful of others made the 3-hour drive out to the farmhouse. What was supposed to be a weekend of food, laughter, and reminiscing turned into something far darker, a night we all wish we could forget. The farmhouse hadn't changed much since I last saw it. The paint was peeling, the shutters were loose, and the barn out back looked like it might collapse at any moment. But Rachel and her husband Greg had done a decent job cleaning up the inside. The kitchen smelled of freshly baked bread, and the dining table was set with care, complete with flickering candles. Everyone arrived in good spirits. Kara brought a bottle of wine, Andrew brought his guitar, and for a while, it felt like any other family gathering. We shared stories about Uncle Henry, reminiscing about his gruff but loving nature. It was comforting, at least until the sun went down. After dinner, we sat in the living room, sipping coffee and passing around old photo albums. That's when Andrew noticed it. "Hey, does anyone remember this picture?" he asked, holding up a photo of a large group of people standing in front of the farmhouse. The group included some of us as kids, along with Uncle Henry, Aunt Martha, and a few older relatives. But there were also strangers in the photo, people none of us recognized. "Who's that?" Kara asked, pointing to a man in the back row. He was tall, with a gaunt face and dark, hollow eyes. Rachel frowned. "I don't know. Must be someone from Henry's side of the family." "Looks like he's staring right at you," Andrew said with a laugh. But the joke didn't land. The longer I looked at the man in the photo, the more unsettled I felt. His eyes seemed to follow me, even when I turned the photo at an angle. Later that evening, I wandered upstairs to find a bathroom. The second floor was quiet, the kind of silence that presses on your ears. Most of the doors were open, revealing dusty guest rooms, but one door at the end of the hall was locked. I jiggled the handle, but it didn't budge. That's when I heard it, a faint scraping sound, like nails dragging across wood, coming from inside the room. I froze, my heart pounding. "Everything okay up there?" Rachel called from downstairs. "Yeah, just looking for the bathroom," I lied, quickly retreating. That night, the tension in the house was palpable. Everyone seemed on edge, though no one wanted to admit it. Around midnight, I got up to grab a glass of water. As I walked down the dark hallway, I saw something out of the corner of my eye, a shadow, long and thin, slipping into the locked room. I stopped in my tracks. "Hello," I whispered, though I wasn't sure I wanted an answer. The door was still locked, but the scraping sound had returned, louder this time. I backed away, my breath quickening, and practically ran back to my room. The next morning, Kara looked pale and exhausted. Over breakfast, she told us about a dream she had, a nightmare, really. "I was in the attic," she said, her voice trembling. There was this old rocking chair in the corner, and a man was sitting in it. He had a black hat and these horrible eyes, like they were made of glass. He kept whispering something, but I couldn't understand him. Then he looked right at me and said, "You shouldn't be here." The room fell silent. No one knew what to say. Andrew, ever the skeptic, decided to check out the attic after breakfast. Rachel reluctantly gave him the key, warning us that it was just full of junk and nothing to get excited about. But when we climbed the narrow stairs, the air grew colder with each step. The attic was cluttered with old furniture, boxes, and cobwebs. In the corner, just like Kara described, was a rocking chair. "It's just a chair," Andrew said, giving it a nudge. But as he did, the chair rocked back on its own, slowly and deliberately. "Okay, nope," Kara said, backing away. "I'm done." While rummaging through one of the boxes, I found an old journal. The pages were yellowed and brittle, filled with sketches of strange symbols. Some of them looked familiar, like the carvings on the trees near the cabin in my childhood. Rachel took one look at the journal and turned pale. These are wards, she said. Henry told me about them once. He said they were to keep something out. Or keep something in, I muttered. That night, the house came alive. The walls groaned, footsteps echoed in empty hallways, and the locked door rattled violently. Everyone gathered in the living room, too scared to sleep. The rocking chair in the attic began to creak, the sound carrying through the vents like a sinister lullaby. Then, without warning, the lights went out. In the darkness, I heard Kara scream. I fumbled for my flashlight, and when I turned it on, I saw him, the man from the photo, standing in the doorway, his hollow eyes glowing faintly. "Get out," he growled, his voice like gravel. We didn't need to be told twice. Grabbing only what we could carry, we fled the farmhouse, piling into our cars and driving until we reached the safety of the nearest town. We haven't spoken much since that night. Rachel refuses to go back to the farmhouse, and she's considering selling it, though part of me wonders if anyone would buy it. As for the journal, I still have it. I've been researching the symbols, trying to understand what Uncle Henry was dealing with. But every time I open it, I can't shake the feeling that I'm being watched. Am I the jerk for wanting answers? Or should I let this go before it's too late? The town that wasn't there. When a journalist investigates a forgotten town, she uncovers a chilling mystery of lights, sounds, and shadowy figures. Trapped in a time loop with no escape, she must unravel the secrets of Ashcroft before it's too late. Will you brave the hum and follow her journey? They say every small town has its secrets, but the one I stumbled upon has stayed with me like a shadow I can't escape. My name is Leah, and I'm a freelance journalist who specializes in urban legends and forgotten places. My latest assignment brought me to Ashcroft, a town in the middle of nowhere. It wasn't on any map, but I'd heard whispers about it from locals while working on a nearby story. They said Ashcroft was abandoned decades ago after the town simply went dark one night. No one really knew what happened, but the rumors were chilling. Entire families disappearing, strange lights in the sky, and a sound described as a hum that you feel in your bones. Curiosity got the better of me, so I packed my camera, notebook, and recorder and drove out to find Ashcroft. What I discovered was far more terrifying than any urban legend. The directions I'd pieced together from locals were vague at best. It took me nearly 2 hours of driving down back roads and overgrown trails before I finally saw the first sign. An old, rusted road marker with the word Ashcroft barely legible under layers of grime. The road narrowed into a single dirt path, hemmed in by dense, towering pines. The sunlight barely pierced the canopy, casting everything in a dim, eerie twilight. My GPS had lost signal an hour ago, and my car's radio only played static. After what felt like an eternity, the trees thinned and the town came into view. Ashcroft looked like a ghost town from an old movie. Weathered clapboard houses lined the main street, their windows dark and empty. A rusted gas station stood at the corner, its sign creaking in the wind. The town square was overgrown with weeds, the fountain in the center dry and cracked. But what struck me most was the silence. It wasn't just quiet. It was an oppressive, unnatural silence. No birds, no insects, not even the sound of wind. It was as if the town itself was holding its breath. As I walked through the town, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Shadows seemed to flicker in the corners of my vision, but every time I turned to look, there was nothing there. The first house I entered was filled with dust and decay. Plates were still set on the dining table, and a pair of children's shoes lay abandoned by the door. It was as if the family had simply vanished in the middle of their day. In the upstairs bedroom, I found a journal on the nightstand. The last entry read, "The hum is louder tonight. I think it's coming for us." It started that evening. A low, droning sound, so deep it was more a vibration than a noise. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once, resonating in my chest and making my teeth ache. The sun was setting, casting the town in a fiery orange glow, and the hum grew louder with each passing minute. By the time darkness fell, it was deafening. I retreated to the car, locking the doors and gripping the steering wheel, but the hum penetrated the vehicle like it wasn't even there. That's when I saw the lights. In the distance, faint blue lights began to dance over the treetops. At first, I thought they were fireflies, but they moved with a strange, unnatural precision, swirling in intricate patterns. As the lights drew closer, I realized they weren't just in the trees. They were coming down the street, weaving in and out of the houses like they were searching for something. And then they stopped, right outside my car. The lights condensed into a single point, and from it emerged a figure. It was humanoid, but impossibly tall and thin, its limbs too long and its movements too fluid. Its face, or what should have been a face, was featureless, a smooth, pale surface that reflected the dim light of the town. I froze, too terrified to move, as it slowly approached the car. It tilted its head as if studying me, its body swaying like a blade of grass in the wind. Then, without warning, it turned and disappeared into the nearest house. The hum continued into the night, a constant, oppressive presence. I couldn't bring myself to sleep, so I grabbed my flashlight and decided to document as much as I could. The first few houses I explored were much the same as the first, abandoned, with no sign of struggle or violence. But in the town hall, I found something that made my blood run cold. In the center of the room was a massive circular symbol etched into the wooden floor. It was intricate, filled with strange runes and geometric patterns. At its center was a pile of objects, photographs, watches, and jewelry, all burned beyond recognition. As I knelt to take a closer look, I felt a sudden rush of cold air, and the hum grew louder. When I turned around, one of the figures was standing in the doorway. This time, it wasn't alone. Behind it, more figures emerged, their movements synchronized like a flock of birds. They didn't approach me. Instead, they stood in a perfect line, swaying in unison as if waiting for something. I didn't wait to find out what. I bolted back to the car, my flashlight shaking in my hand. I decided to leave Ashcroft that night, but the town had other plans. No matter which road I took, I always ended up back in the square. The gas station, the fountain, the darkened houses, it was as if the town was folding in on itself, trapping me in a never-ending loop. By dawn, I was exhausted and disoriented, and the hum hadn't stopped. That's when I realized the figures were following me. Desperate, I returned to the town hall and stood in the center of the symbol. I don't know why. Maybe I thought it was a way out. The hum became unbearable, and the lights returned, swirling around me in a frenzy. The figures emerged from the shadows, circling me like predators. One stepped forward, reaching out with an impossibly long hand. As its fingers brushed my shoulder, everything went black. I woke up in my car on the side of a highway, miles from where Ashcroft should have been. My equipment was gone, and my watch had stopped at exactly 3:17 a.m., the time I'd entered the town. I tried to return, but I couldn't find the road again. Ashcroft was gone, as if it had never existed. But sometimes, when I close my eyes, I still hear the hum, the endless night. A wandering journalist seeks the truth about a legendary town that only appears after dark. What he finds is a living entity, a predator that lures its victims into an eternal, starless night. As the town's shadowy enforcers close in, he must unravel its secrets before becoming part of its haunting, endless cycle. Will you brave the journey into the dark? They call me a wanderer, a seeker of places that don't want to be found. My name is Ethan, and for the last decade, I've been exploring the world's most obscure and forgotten locations, abandoned towns, haunted forests, sunken cities. My work has taken me to places most people would never dare to go. But there's one experience I can't write about for publication. One story I've never told anyone, until now. In the fall of 2019, I went looking for a place known only in whispers, the Endless Night, a town that, according to urban legend, only exists after dark. People say it moves, appearing and disappearing at random across the country, and those who find it are rarely seen again. Skeptics dismiss it as a hoax or an overblown ghost story, but for those of us in the community of urban explorers, it's the ultimate mystery. When I finally found it, I realized why no one ever leaves. The Endless Night isn't just a place, it's a predator. I first heard about the town from an old blog post written in 2008. The writer, a fellow urban explorer who went by the handle Hollow Eye, described a surreal experience of stumbling upon a village bathed in perpetual night. His descriptions were vivid but fragmented, as though his memory was incomplete. The final entry in his post read, "They're here. The lights are getting closer. If anyone finds this, don't follow the shadows." After that, Hollow Eye vanished from the online community, and no one could track him down. His cryptic story stuck with me for years, and eventually, I decided to find out for myself if the endless night was real. I spent months following obscure clues, redacted government documents, local legends, and scraps of testimony from people who claimed to have seen strange lights in the woods. Everything pointed to a region in the Appalachians where thick forests and winding trails could hide just about anything. I set out alone in mid-October, armed with my usual gear: a tent, plenty of food, a GPS, and a camera to document whatever I found. The first few days of the trip were uneventful. The forest was beautiful in its autumn colors, and the trails were quiet, save for the occasional rustle of leaves underfoot. It wasn't until the fourth night that I saw the lights. I was setting up camp when a faint glow appeared in the distance. It wasn't firelight or the beam of a flashlight. It was cold and blue, flickering like the aurora borealis. My heart raced as I grabbed my camera and followed the light deeper into the woods. After an hour of walking, I reached a clearing. The air was heavy, and the forest was eerily silent, as though the trees themselves were holding their breath. In the clearing stood a town that hadn't been there during the day. The buildings were old and weathered, their wooden frames warped with age. A single street ran through the center, lined with gas lamps that flickered with the same cold blue light I'd seen in the distance. The sky above was pitch black, devoid of stars or moon, and yet the town was illuminated as though caught in the glow of perpetual twilight. I couldn't help but take a step forward. The moment I did, the forest behind me vanished. There was no turning back. The first building I entered was a small general store. The shelves were lined with dusty cans, jars of preserved goods, and an old cash register that looked as though it hadn't been touched in decades. I took a few photos, but my camera flickered and died halfway through. As I turned to leave, I heard it, the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, and impossibly loud against the silence. I froze, my heart pounding. When I turned back, I saw a figure standing in the doorway. It wasn't human. The figure was tall and thin, with elongated limbs and a face that seemed to shift and blur as I looked at it. Its eyes were pinpricks of blue light, and its body shimmered like a mirage. Without thinking, I bolted out the back door and into the street. But the figure didn't follow. Instead, it stood motionless, watching me with those glowing eyes. Over the next several hours, I explored cautiously, trying to make sense of the town. I found a church with broken stained glass windows, a schoolhouse with desks scattered across the floor, and a diner where the smell of coffee still lingered in the air, though no one was inside. It didn't take long to realize there were rules here, unspoken but undeniable. The blue-lit figures, which I began calling shades, never entered buildings. The lamps lining the street seemed to repel them. As long as I stayed near the light, I was safe. The town had no clocks, but I knew time wasn't passing normally. My watch had stopped the moment I entered. In one of the houses, I found a journal. The handwriting was frantic, the pages stained with what I hoped was just water. The entries described someone else's experience in the town, a person who had arrived under circumstances eerily similar to mine. The last entry read, "The light is fading. If they find me, I don't think I'll ever leave. They don't just kill you, they take you, become you." That night, the lamps began to flicker. The shades grew bolder, drifting closer to the edges of the light. I ran from building to building, barely staying ahead of them. My flashlight was useless, and my phone refused to turn on. At one point, I tripped and fell in the street. The closest shade turned its head toward me, its movements slow and deliberate, like a predator savoring the moment before a kill. I scrambled to my feet and dove into the nearest building, slamming the door behind me. When I turned, I found myself in a library. The library was unlike any building I'd seen so far. It was vast, far larger than it should have been, with endless rows of shelves stretching into the darkness. At the center of the room was a glowing orb of blue light, pulsating like a heartbeat. As I approached, the hum returned, a deep, resonant sound that made the floor tremble. The orb seemed alive, its surface shifting and swirling like liquid. I reached out to touch it, and in that moment, I understood. The town wasn't just a place, it was a living entity, feeding on those who stumbled into it. The shades weren't independent beings, they were fragments of the town itself, sent out to lure and trap its prey. The orb was its heart. I don't know why, but I decided to destroy it. Maybe it was instinct, or maybe I was just desperate. I grabbed a heavy book from one of the nearby shelves and swung it at the orb with all my strength. The instant the book connected, the orb exploded in a burst of blinding light. The hum rose to an ear-splitting crescendo, and the ground beneath me shook violently. The shelves collapsed, sending books tumbling like an avalanche. The shades howled, a terrible, inhuman sound, and began to disintegrate, their forms dissolving into the air like smoke. The town itself began to warp and fade, the buildings folding in on themselves as if consumed by an unseen force. The last thing I remember was running through the collapsing streets, the light growing brighter and brighter until everything went white. I woke up in the forest at dawn, my gear scattered around me. The clearing where the town had stood was gone, replaced by a thicket of trees. My watch had stopped at midnight, and my camera was missing. I've tried to find the town again, but it's as if it never existed. Still, I can't forget what I saw. And sometimes, when the night stretches too long and the silence grows too deep, I hear the hum. And I wonder if the endless night is still out there, waiting for its next victim. The hotel that never lets you leave. When a weary traveler checks into a mysterious hotel, he finds himself trapped in a surreal nightmare of shifting halls, sinister staff, and a mirror that knows more than it should. As reality unravels, he must confront the truth about the Crescent Pines or be consumed by it. Will you dare to stay the night? I've stayed in hundreds of hotels over the years. My job as a corporate consultant has me traveling constantly, hopping from city to city and living out of suitcases. Most hotels are forgettable, a bed, a desk, a decent shower. But there's one hotel I'll never forget. I wasn't even supposed to stay there. It was a last-minute trip and the major chains were fully booked. My assistant found a boutique hotel tucked away on the edge of town called the Crescent Pines. It had no website and only a handful of reviews, but desperation pushed me to take a chance. If I had known what awaited me, I would have slept in my car. The Crescent Pines was hidden down a long, winding road surrounded by dense forest. It was an imposing 3-story building, its Gothic architecture striking against the gray sky. As I pulled into the gravel lot, a chill ran down my spine. Something about the place felt wrong, though I couldn't put my finger on it. Inside, the lobby was dimly lit, the air heavy with the scent of old wood and lavender. The receptionist, a pale, thin man with an unsettlingly wide smile, greeted me as though he'd been expecting me. "Welcome, Mr. Carter," he said, handing me an old-fashioned key. I hadn't given him my name. My room was on the 3rd floor, at the very end of a long, carpeted hallway. The key turned with a heavy click, and the door creaked open to reveal a quaint but outdated room. The furniture was antique, the bed draped in heavy velvet curtains. A single window looked out over the forest, the trees swaying gently in the wind. On the desk, I found a handwritten note. "The Crescent Pines is honored to host you. Please do not leave your room after midnight." I laughed it off as some quirky hotel policy and tossed the note aside. That night, I would come to regret it. I woke up to a strange sound around 2 a.m., like someone whispering just outside my door. At first, I thought it was another guest, but the whispers grew louder, more insistent. When I peeked through the peephole, the hallway was empty. But as I pressed my ear to the door, I felt something, a presence on the other side. The air seemed to ripple, and the whispers turned into low, guttural murmurs. "Go back to bed," a voice said, clear and sharp. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The next morning, I decided to check out early. But when I got into the elevator, something bizarre happened. The doors closed, and the numbers on the panel began to flash erratically. The elevator moved, but it didn't stop on the ground floor. Instead, it opened to a hallway I didn't recognize. The walls were bare, the carpet worn, and the air felt oppressive. I tried pressing the button for the lobby, but the elevator refused to move. Stepping out, I saw doors lining the hallway, each one slightly ajar. From the shadows inside, eyes watched me. I eventually made it back to the lobby, but the receptionist's demeanor had changed. His wide smile was gone, replaced by a tight-lipped expression. "Is something wrong, Mr. Carter?" he asked, his voice tinged with something I couldn't place. Mockery, maybe, or warning. "I'd like to check out," I said firmly. "I'm afraid that's not possible," he replied. "Your stay is indefinite." Before I could argue, two bellhops appeared behind him. Their faces were eerily identical, their eyes dark and unblinking. They didn't say a word, but stared at me as though daring me to run. Determined to find answers, I began exploring the hotel. On the second floor, I found a lounge filled with guests, but something was wrong. They were all sitting unnaturally still, their heads slightly tilted, as if listening to something I couldn't hear. When I approached a woman sitting by the fireplace, she turned to me slowly, her eyes glassy. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered. "None of us should." Before I could respond, she turned back to the fire and went still again, as if I wasn't even there. That night, I stayed in my room, bolting the door and barricading it with furniture. Around midnight, the whispers began again, louder this time, and accompanied by the sound of footsteps pacing the hallway. The footsteps stopped outside my door. Then came the knock, slow, deliberate, and impossibly loud. "Let us in," a voice said. It wasn't human. It was layered, as if multiple voices were speaking at once. I didn't move. After what felt like hours, the footsteps faded and the whispers dissipated. On the third day, I decided to escape. I packed my things and left through the back door, heading into the forest. The receptionist watched me go, but didn't stop me, his unsettling smile returning as I walked away. The forest was dense and disorienting. No matter which direction I went, I always ended up back at the hotel. The crescent pines loomed in the distance, its windows glowing faintly in the dim light. The only time I made it farther than a few hundred yards, I heard a scream, a blood-curdling, inhuman wail that echoed through the trees. I ran back to the hotel without looking back. Desperate for answers, I began searching the hotel's restricted areas. In the basement, I found a locked door marked staff only. Using a bobby pin, I picked the lock and stepped inside. The room was massive, filled with rows of beds. On each bed lay a motionless body, their faces pale and gaunt. Some were staff members I recognized, while others were strangers. All of them were breathing shallowly, as if in some sort of stasis. At the center of the room was a massive, ornate mirror. Its surface was dark and rippling, and as I approached, I saw my reflection, but it wasn't me. The figure in the mirror smiled wickedly, its eyes gleaming with malice. "You're almost ready," it said in my voice. That night, I woke to find my reflection standing at the foot of my bed. It wasn't moving, but its eyes followed me as I scrambled out of bed. The whispers filled the room, louder than ever, and the walls began to close in. The floor seemed to stretch endlessly, and the door to the hallway vanished. The last thing I remember is the mirror in the basement, its surface pulling me in like quicksand. My reflection was smiling, but I was screaming. When I woke up, I was back in my car, parked in the gravel lot. The hotel was gone, replaced by an empty field. My phone had no signal, and my belongings were gone, save for a single key in my pocket, the key to room 309. I've tried to forget, but every now and then, I dream of the Crescent Pines. In my dreams, I'm still inside, wandering its endless halls, searching for a way out. Sometimes, I hear the whispers again, even when I'm awake. The Sanctuary of Silence. A wrong turn leads to a chilling retreat where silence reigns, reflections deceive, and an entity known only as the Keeper waits to claim its next victim. Will you dare to enter this sanctuary, or will you listen to the whispers of those who tried to escape? I didn't intend to end up there. Nobody does. The Sanctuary of Silence isn't a place you find, it's a place that finds you. My name is Claire, and for the last 2 years, I've lived with the shadow of what I saw there, or more accurately, what I didn't see. It started innocently enough, like most nightmares do. I was on a road trip through the Northeast, hoping to clear my head after my divorce. I'd planned a route through quiet, scenic backroads, staying at quaint inns and eating at diners that smelled of fresh pie and nostalgia. That changed when I took a wrong turn. It was late afternoon when I noticed the sign, Sanctuary Road, Scenic Drive. I was low on gas, but the promise of a shortcut sounded appealing. The road was narrow, lined with trees that seemed to stretch endlessly into the sky. The further I drove, the darker it grew, even though the sun was still up. My GPS stopped working first, then my phone. The road became bumpier, the asphalt cracking in places as if it hadn't been maintained in decades. But every time I thought about turning around, the trees pressed closer, their branches reaching over the road like skeletal fingers. After what felt like hours, I saw it, a sprawling stone building that seemed to rise out of the earth itself. The air around it was unnaturally still. A weathered sign outside read, "Sanctuary of Silence, Retreat for the Weary." I pulled into the gravel lot, hoping for a phone signal or at least someone to point me back to the highway. I had no idea what I was walking into. The front door was massive, carved with intricate patterns that seemed to shift the longer I looked at them. When I knocked, the sound seemed to vanish into the air, swallowed by the eerie silence around me. An elderly woman opened the door. Her face was pale and gaunt, her eyes sharp and too bright for someone her age. She smiled warmly, but something about it felt, "Welcome," she said in a voice so soft it was barely above a whisper. "You've come to rest, haven't you?" Before I could correct her, she stepped aside, gesturing for me to enter. The lobby was vast, its walls lined with dark wood and ancient tapestries. A grand staircase spiraled upward, and corridors stretched in every direction. The air smelled faintly of lavender and something metallic. "I just need directions," I said, but she didn't seem to hear me. Instead, she handed me a small brass key with the number 17 engraved on it. Against my better judgment, I climbed the staircase to the second floor. The hallway was dimly lit by flickering sconces, and the carpet beneath my feet felt damp. When I reached room 17, I hesitated. Something about the door felt alive. The wood was warm to the touch, and the key turned in the lock with a soft, almost satisfied click. Inside, the room was simple but oddly comforting. A four-poster bed with heavy curtains, a single window overlooking the forest, and a mirror that seemed far too large for the wall it hung on. I tried my phone again, no signal. Frustrated, I decided to rest for a moment before heading back downstairs. That's when I heard it, the sound of breathing. It wasn't mine. The breathing grew louder, heavier, until it seemed to fill the entire room. I searched everywhere, under the bed, behind the curtains, even in the tiny closet, but found nothing. The mirror caught my attention. Its surface was flawless, reflecting the room perfectly, but when I looked closer, I noticed something horrifying. My reflection wasn't moving. I stared, frozen, as the reflection slowly turned its head to face me. Its eyes were dark voids, empty and endless, and its mouth moved, forming words I couldn't hear. I ran out of the room, slamming the door behind me. I tried to leave the sanctuary, but the front door wouldn't budge. Neither would the windows. The receptionist, still smiling that unnatural smile, appeared behind me. "You can't leave yet," she said softly. "You've only just arrived." I ran through the hallways, hoping to find another exit. That's when I saw them, the other residents. They were scattered throughout the building, sitting perfectly still in chairs, on benches, even on the floor. Their faces were blank, their eyes unblinking. When I approached one, a young man in a faded suit, he turned his head toward me in a single jerky motion. "Join us," he whispered. Desperate for answers, I stumbled into a massive library. The shelves were filled with books, but every one I opened was blank. In the center of the room stood a desk, and on it lay a single handwritten journal. The entries described someone else's experience at the sanctuary, a person who had arrived under similar circumstances. They wrote about the silence, the residents, and a mysterious entity referred to only as the Keeper. The final entry read, "Do not let it touch you. Once it does, you are no longer yourself." I didn't have to wait long to meet it. That night, as I huddled in room 17, the door creaked open. Standing in the hallway was a figure draped in shadows, its form constantly shifting. It had no face, no discernible features, but its presence was suffocating. The breathing returned, louder than ever, and the room grew colder. The mirror began to ripple, its surface distorting until it no longer reflected the room. It reflected me, but not as I was. The version of me in the mirror was older, worn, and lifeless, its eyes filled with despair. The Keeper stepped closer, reaching out with a hand that wasn't a hand, its fingers stretching like smoke. I ran. Down the stairs, through the endless corridors, past the silent residents, who now turned their heads to follow me as I passed. Every door I opened led to another hallway, or a room I didn't recognize. The sanctuary was shifting, its layout changing with every turn. Finally, I found myself in the basement. The walls were damp, and the air smelled of decay. In the center of the room was a massive stone altar, covered in strange symbols that pulsed faintly with light. A voice filled the room, not spoken but felt, vibrating in my chest. "You cannot leave. You belong to us." The keeper was everywhere now, its shadow stretching across the walls, the ceiling, the floor. I could feel its presence inside me, a creeping cold that gnawed at my sanity. I tried to fight it, to resist, but the sanctuary itself seemed to conspire against me. The last thing I remember is standing in front of the mirror in room 17. My reflection was smiling, its dark eyes gleaming with triumph. As the keeper's hand touched my shoulder, everything went black. When I woke up, I was sitting in my car on the side of an unfamiliar road. The sanctuary was gone, replaced by an empty field. My phone had signal again, but the date was wrong. 3 weeks had passed since I'd left home. I've tried to move on, but something isn't right. My reflection in mirrors lingers just a little too long. Sometimes when the world is quiet, I hear the breathing again. And in my dreams, I'm still there, trapped in the sanctuary of silence, waiting for the keeper to come. The village beneath the earth. When a team of archaeologists discovers a hidden village deep underground, they awaken something ancient and malevolent. As whispers fill the air and faceless figures close in, the team must confront a horrifying truth. Some places are meant to stay buried. Will you dare to descend into the darkness? I'm not sure if I should even be telling this story. Some things are better left buried, literally. But the nightmares won't stop, and maybe writing it down will help. My name is Sam, and 2 years ago, I was part of a team investigating an underground cavern system near a small Appalachian town. We weren't spelunkers or adventurers. We were archaeologists chasing whispers of an ancient settlement hidden deep beneath the earth. The locals warned us not to go, muttering about a place they called the Sunless Village. They told us it was cursed, that the people who went there didn't come back. We thought it was just folklore. We were wrong. Our team of 5 included me, Dr. Miriam Kane, our lead archaeologist, Luis, our tech guy, Rachel, a geologist, and Tim, our guide. The cavern had only recently been discovered, a sinkhole exposing its entrance in a dense patch of forest. The first few hours were exhilarating. The air inside was cold and damp, the walls glittering with veins of quartz. We found ancient carvings within the first mile, spirals, stick figures, and symbols we didn't recognize. Miriam was ecstatic, snapping photos and sketching furiously in her notebook. But as we ventured deeper, the carvings grew stranger. Figures with elongated limbs and twisted faces, their eyes hollow and empty, began to appear on the walls. Luis joked that we'd stumbled onto an alien art gallery, but none of us laughed. About 4 miles in, we reached the first chamber, a vast, cathedral-like space with a ceiling so high our lights couldn't reach it. In the center stood a massive stone pillar covered in more carvings. At its base was a circular depression filled with what looked like ash. Rachel knelt to examine it. "This is bone," she whispered, her face pale. Miriam dismissed it as remnants of an ancient ritual. "This is incredible," she said, her voice trembling with excitement. "It's like a forgotten culture, perfectly preserved." But as we stood there, a low hum filled the air, deep and resonant. It wasn't coming from any specific direction. It was as if the cavern itself was alive. Tim suggested we turn back, but Miriam insisted we press on. The tunnel leading out of the chamber was narrow, forcing us to crawl on our hands and knees. The hum grew louder, vibrating in our chests and making our teeth ache. Eventually, the tunnel opened into a smaller chamber. This one was different, darker, colder, and filled with the unmistakable stench of decay. In the center was a pool of black water, so still it looked like glass. Surrounding it were crude stone houses, their doorways yawning like open mouths. Luis shined his flashlight into one of the houses. "It's empty," he said, his voice echoing eerily. But as his light passed over the walls, I saw them, shadows that didn't belong to us, moving just out of reach. That's when we heard it, a faint shuffling sound, like bare feet on stone. It came from everywhere at once, growing louder with each passing second. Tim raised his headlamp, and for a moment we saw them. Figures lurking at the edges of the chamber. They were human-shaped, but wrong. Their limbs were too long, their movements jerky, and their faces, they didn't have faces. Just smooth, pale surfaces where their features should have been. "They're watching us," Rachel whispered, her voice trembling. Miriam tried to approach one, but it skittered away into the shadows like a spider. The others began to move closer, their eyeless faces turning toward us in unison. We retreated to the tunnel, but the figures didn't follow. The hum grew louder, now accompanied by faint whispers. At first, I thought they were in my head, but then Rachel spoke. "Do you hear that?" she asked, her voice shaking. They're saying my name." We all froze. The whispers grew clearer, each of us hearing our own name being called, softly but insistently. It was impossible to tell where they were coming from, above, below, all around us. "They want us to stay," Tim said, his face pale. "They want us to join them." Back in the chamber, the black pool began to ripple, though there was no wind and no sign of movement. Miriam approached it, her flashlight flickering as she leaned closer. "This isn't water," she said, dipping her gloved fingers into the liquid. When she pulled her hand back, the glove was gone, dissolved into nothing. The liquid clung to her skin, crawling up her arm like living ink. Suddenly, she screamed, clutching her head as if something were burrowing into her skull. "They're in my mind," she cried. "They're showing me." Before she could finish, she collapsed, her body going rigid. Louise tried to carry Miriam, but she was impossibly heavy, her body cold and stiff. As we argued about what to do, the figures returned, stepping out of the shadows and forming a circle around us. They didn't move closer, but their presence was suffocating. The whispers grew deafening, the hum shaking the very ground beneath us. The black pool began to bubble, and from its depths rose something that defied comprehension, a massive, writhing form that seemed to be made of the same liquid, its surface shifting and shimmering. One by one, the figures turned toward Miriam. "They're choosing her," Rachel said, her voice hollow. "We left her." I still hate myself for it, but there was no other choice. As the figures closed in, we bolted for the tunnel, their whispers chasing us like a physical force. The way back was longer than it should have been, the tunnel twisting and narrowing until we could barely crawl. Luis was the first to disappear. One moment he was behind me, and the next he was gone, his screams fading into the distance. Rachel was next, pulled into the darkness by something I couldn't see. Tim and I made it to the first chamber, but the pillar was different now. The carvings glowed faintly, and the ash at its base was smoldering. Tim and I emerged from the sinkhole just as the sun was rising. The forest was silent, the world eerily normal after what we'd experienced. We didn't speak as we packed our gear and drove back to town, but the whispers haven't stopped. Late at night, I hear them calling my name, urging me to return. Sometimes I wake up with dirt under my nails, as if I've been digging in my sleep. Tim disappeared 6 months ago. His wife said he left a note that read, "I have to go back. They're waiting for me." Now, I'm the only one left. The house that ate time. When a man receives an invitation to an isolated mansion, he finds himself trapped in a nightmare of shifting rooms, faceless guests, and a clock that defies reality. As time unravels and the house's true purpose is revealed, he must fight to escape before it consumes him entirely. Will you dare to open the door? I don't expect you to believe me. I wouldn't believe me if I hadn't lived through it. There's a house deep in the woods of northern Maine, a house that doesn't obey the laws of time or reality. I wasn't looking for it, but it found me, and now I'm not sure if I ever truly escaped. My name is Daniel, and this is the story of how I lost weeks of my life to a place that shouldn't exist, a place where time stretches, bends, and consumes everything. If you ever hear rumors about the house that ate time, turn around, go back, burn the map if you have to. It started with a postcard. I received it in the mail one Thursday morning, sandwiched between junk flyers and utility bills. The card was plain, with an image of a large Victorian-style house surrounded by dense forest. The message on the back was simple. You are invited to the Hartfield House, 15 miles north of Winter's End. Arrive by sunset. Do not be late. There was no signature, no return address. I should have ignored it, but something about the handwriting nagged at me. It looked eerily similar to my late mother's, who'd passed away 3 years earlier. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had to go. Winter's End was a forgotten town tucked into the hills of Maine, little more than a scattering of houses, a general store, and a gas station. The locals were wary, watching me with guarded expressions as I asked for directions to Hartfield House. "Don't go there," the gas station attendant warned. his voice low. Nobody comes back the same. What do you mean? I asked, but he only shook his head and muttered something about the house feeding. By the time I found the dirt road leading into the woods, the sun was already dipping below the horizon. I should have turned back. Instead, I pressed on. The Hartfield house emerged from the trees like a phantom, its silhouette dark against the fiery sky. The house was enormous, its windows gleaming like empty eyes. A wrought iron gate stood open, creaking softly in the breeze. The air felt heavier as I approached, the kind of pressure that makes your ears pop. My car engine sputtered and died just as I pulled into the gravel driveway. It wouldn't start again. The front door opened before I even knocked, revealing a grand foyer lit by flickering candelabras. The walls were lined with portraits of people whose eyes seemed to follow me. A staircase spiraled upward, disappearing into shadows. I stepped inside, and the door slammed shut behind me. On a small table in the foyer, I found a handwritten note. It read, "Do not open any doors marked with an X. Do not stay in one room for more than an hour. When you hear the clock chime, find a mirror and do not look away until the chime stops." The note was unsigned, but the handwriting matched the postcard. My pulse quickened. Was this a joke? A test? Or something worse? I wandered through the house, trying to make sense of its layout. Every room was different. One was a lavish dining room with a table set for a dozen people, another a library with shelves that stretched to the ceiling. But something was off. The shadows seemed too deep, the air too still. I heard the first chime just after midnight. It echoed through the house, long and mournful. Remembering the note, I scrambled to find a mirror. I found one in a parlor down the hall and stared into it, my heart pounding. For a moment, my reflection didn't move. It stared back at me with wide, empty eyes, and its lips curled into a smile that wasn't mine. Then the chime stopped, and the reflection returned to normal. The next morning, I tried to leave, but the front door led to a brick wall. The windows showed the forest outside, but no matter how hard I tried, they wouldn't open. As I explored further, I realized the house was changing. A hallway I'd walked down the night before was now twice as long. A room I'd passed through earlier had vanished completely. The house was alive, shifting and twisting around me like a living organism. I found a grandfather clock in the library, its pendulum swinging erratically. The time on the clock face changed every time I looked at it. Hours, minutes, even days jumping forward and backward. My watch had stopped completely. On the third day, or what I thought was the third day, I heard voices. Following the sound, I entered a ballroom filled with people in elaborate antique clothing. They were laughing, drinking, and dancing, but something about them was wrong. Their movements were too smooth, too synchronized, as if they were puppets controlled by invisible strings. When one of them turned to look at me, I saw that their eyes were black voids, endless and empty. "You're late," the man said, his voice echoing unnaturally. I stumbled back, and when I blinked, the ballroom was empty. The only sound was the faint ticking of the grandfather clock. Desperation pushed me to disobey the rules. On the 5th, or was it the 10th, I opened one of the doors marked with an X. Inside was a void, a swirling expanse of darkness that seemed to pull at my very soul. I saw things in the void, glimpses of other places, other times. A battlefield drenched in blood, a child crying in an empty room, a city crumbling under a blackened sky. The door slammed shut on its own, and when I turned, I was no longer in the hallway. I was standing in the middle of the forest at night, the Hartfield house looming in the distance. But when I tried to run toward it, the trees shifted, closing me in. I was back in the house in an instant, as if I'd never left. The clock chimed 13 times on what I believe was my 12th day. This time, there was no mirror to be found. I felt something behind me, its breath cold against my neck. I turned slowly and saw a figure cloaked in shadow, its face obscured. "Time is not yours here," it whispered. Its voice was like broken glass scraping against stone. "It belongs to the house." I don't know how I found the way out. Maybe the house let me go, or maybe I broke free by sheer will. One moment, I was running through endless hallways, and the next, I was standing on the side of a highway, my car parked a few feet away. Weeks had passed since I'd entered the house, though it felt like years. My phone was dead, my clothes were torn, and my hair had streaks of gray that weren't there before. The Hartfield house was gone. In its place was an empty clearing. I've tried to tell myself it wasn't real, but the scars remain. My reflection still lingers too long in mirrors, and I can't bear to hear the sound of a clock ticking. Sometimes, late at night, I dream of the house, its rooms shifting endlessly, the clock's chime echoing in my ears, and every morning when I check my mailbox, I half expect to find another postcard. The Shadows of Black Hollow, Part 1. When a group of friends explores a forgotten forest, they awaken an ancient, malevolent force. As the forest twists and the whispers grow louder, they must confront a horrifying truth. Black Hollow isn't just a place, it's a trap. Will you dare to enter the Shadows' domain? I never believed in the supernatural. Ghost stories, urban legends, the tales people told around campfires, it was all just entertainment to me, fiction meant to thrill but ultimately lacking substance. But now, I can't even close my eyes without seeing it, hearing it. I've tried to move on, to pretend it didn't happen, but the truth is, something followed me out of Black Hollow, and it's only a matter of time before it takes me too. This is the story of how my friends and I stumbled into something we didn't understand, something ancient, malevolent, and patient. It started with an old map we found at a flea market. My best friend Alex was always dragging me, Jordan, to places like that. He loved collecting oddities, old coins, mysterious trinkets, anything with a hint of history. That day, as we sifted through boxes of junk, Alex pulled out a rolled-up parchment. "Check this out," he said, unrolling it to reveal a hand-drawn map. The paper was yellowed, the ink faded, but the details were intricate. Mountains, rivers, forests, and at the center, a place marked Black Hollow. "What's Black Hollow?" I asked, running my fingers over the map. "Don't know," Alex said, grinning, "but let's find out." That's how it began, a simple plan to explore a forgotten place. We roped in our other friends, Emily, Chris, and Megan, and decided to make a weekend of it. None of us had any idea what we were walking into. Black Hollow wasn't on any modern map. Using the old parchment and a combination of GPS and gut instinct, we drove for hours into the Appalachian wilderness. The roads became narrower, the forest thicker, until we reached a point where the trees seemed to swallow the sunlight. "This place is creepy," Emily said, peering out the window. "Exactly why we're here," Alex replied, parking the car at the end of a dirt path. The map indicated that Black Hollow was about 3 miles into the woods. We grabbed our gear, backpacks, flashlights, and plenty of water, and set off. At first, it was just like any other hike. Uneven trails, birds chirping, the occasional rustle of leaves. But as we got closer, the forest grew quieter. No birds, no wind, just the sound of our footsteps crunching on the underbrush. "Anyone else feel like we're being watched?" Megan asked. "Don't start," Chris muttered, but I felt it too, a prickling sensation at the back of my neck, like unseen eyes were following us. We reached Black Hollow just before sunset. The clearing was vast and eerily symmetrical, as though the trees had been pushed back by some invisible force. At the center stood a crumbling stone structure, half buried in moss and vines. It wasn't large, maybe the size of a small chapel, but there was something about it that made my stomach churn. "This is it," Alex said, his voice barely above a whisper. We approached cautiously, our footsteps slow and deliberate. The building had no roof, just jagged stone walls that reached skyward like skeletal hands. The air inside was cooler, heavy with the scent of damp earth. In the center of the structure was a circular pit, about 6 feet wide. Its edges were lined with ancient carvings, symbols none of us recognized. At the bottom of the pit lay what looked like a shattered stone altar, its pieces scattered and charred. "What is this place?" Emily asked, her voice trembling. "A tomb, maybe?" Alex suggested, though he didn't sound convinced. None of us wanted to linger, but Alex was insistent. "Let's set up camp here," he said. "Just one night." I should have said no. We all should have. We pitched our tents just outside the stone structure, the firelight casting long, flickering shadows. Alex was giddy, poring over the map and speculating about the carvings. The rest of us were quieter, uneasy. Around midnight, the wind picked up, howling through the trees like a distant scream. Megan swore she heard footsteps in the woods, but when we shined our flashlights, there was nothing there. Then came the whispering. At first, I thought it was the wind, but the sound was too deliberate. Low, murmuring voices, speaking in a language I didn't understand. The others heard it too. We huddled closer to the fire, our backs to the stone structure. "We're just freaking ourselves out," Alex said, though his hands were shaking. The whispers grew louder, circling us like a predator stalking its prey. And then, just as suddenly as they'd started, they stopped. We didn't sleep that night. In the morning, we found the markings. They were carved into the trees around our campsite, symbols similar to the ones on the stone structure, but fresher, as though someone or something had made them while we slept. "We should leave," Megan said, her voice firm. "This isn't normal." Alex brushed it off, insisting we were overreacting. "Probably some old hermit messing with us," he said, though he couldn't explain how the carvings had appeared so quickly or so silently. We decided to explore the surrounding woods, hoping to find more clues about the hollow, but the further we went, the stranger things became. The forest seemed to twist and loop, paths leading us back to the same spots, no matter which direction we took. The trees grew denser, their branches intertwining overhead to block out the sun. And then we found the bones. To be continued in Part 2. The Shadows of Black Hollow, Part 2. We found the bones. They were scattered across the forest floor. Animal bones, human bones, all jumbled together. Some were ancient, bleached white by time, while others were disturbingly fresh. At the center of the pile was a skull, its surface etched with the same symbols we'd seen on the trees. "Okay, I'm done," Chris said, backing away. "We're leaving. Now." For once, Alex didn't argue. We turned back toward the campsite, but the forest seemed different, the trails narrower and the air heavier. By the time we reached the clearing, the sun was setting again. Our tents had been slashed open, their contents strewn across the ground. We debated hiking out in the dark, but the forest felt too hostile, too alive. Reluctantly, we decided to stay one more night, huddling together by the fire. That's when Emily started to change. It began with her eyes. They seemed darker, deeper, as though the light couldn't reach them. She complained of a headache, clutching her temples and muttering under her breath. At first, we thought she was just stressed, but as the night wore on, her behavior grew more erratic. "They're watching us," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "They're everywhere." "Who's watching us?" I asked, but she didn't answer. Instead, she pointed toward the stone structure, her hand trembling. "They want us to go inside." Against our better judgment, we decided to investigate the pit. Alex and I climbed down, our flashlights illuminating the jagged walls. At the bottom, the air was cold and still, the smell of decay almost overwhelming. That's when we saw the carvings, hundreds of them, etched into the stone in tight, concentric circles. They seemed to tell a story, a village, a ritual, and something rising from the earth. At the center of it all was a figure, featureless but towering, its arms outstretched. The whispers returned, louder this time, echoing off the walls. Alex stumbled back, his flashlight flickering. "We need to leave," he said, his voice trembling. "Now." But when we climbed back out, Emily was gone. We searched the woods, calling her name, but the forest seemed to swallow our voices. The trails twisted endlessly, leading us back to the stone structure, no matter which direction we went. Then we heard her scream. It was faint, distant, but unmistakable. We ran toward the sound, our flashlights cutting through the darkness. When we found her, she was standing in a clearing, her back to us. "Emily?" Megan called out, her voice shaking. Emily turned slowly, and my stomach dropped. Her eyes were completely black, her skin pale and mottled. She smiled, a slow, unnatural smile, and whispered, "It's too late. It's already here." The ground began to tremble, the trees swaying violently. From the pit came a low, guttural roar, followed by the sound of something massive moving beneath the earth. The whispers rose to a deafening crescendo, drowning out our screams. A shadow emerged from the stone structure, towering and shapeless, its edges flickering like fire. It moved with an unnatural fluidity, stretching and shifting as it approached us. My legs felt like lead, my body frozen in place. The others ran. I don't know how, but I forced myself to move, stumbling through the forest as the shadow loomed closer. I could feel it behind me, its presence cold and suffocating. I don't remember how I made it out. One moment I was running, the shadow's whispers filling my ears, and the next I was lying on the side of a highway, gasping for air. My clothes were torn, my body covered in cuts and bruises. The others didn't make it. Search teams found no trace of Alex, Megan, or Emily. Chris was discovered weeks later, wandering the forest miles away, his mind shattered. He hasn't spoken since. I wish I could say it's over, but I know it's not. The whispers still follow me, growing louder with each passing day. And in my dreams, I see the shadow, waiting patiently in Black Hollow. End of the Shadows of Black Hollow. The Scream of Hollow Ridge, Part 1. When two friends investigate a legendary scream in the Appalachian wilderness, they find themselves hunted by shadows and haunted by a girl who cannot escape. As the forest twists around them and the scream grows louder, they must confront the horrifying truth. Hollow Ridge doesn't let its victims go easily. Will you dare to listen to the scream? My name is Anna, and I've always been drawn to the macabre. Ghost stories, creepy folklore, tales of the unknown. I devoured them like candy. So when I heard about Hollow Ridge, I couldn't resist. The legend was simple but chilling. A ghostly scream echoes through the cliffs at midnight, a sound so piercing it stops hearts. The locals say it's the cry of a girl who died there over a century ago, her soul trapped by the rocky gorge. They call her the Wailing Girl. When my best friend Lily suggested we investigate for her podcast, Voices in the Void, I jumped at the chance. Neither of us believed in ghosts, not really, but the idea of exploring the Eerie Gorge for a night? It was too good to pass up. We were wrong. Hollow Ridge is more than just a ghost story. It's a place where the line between the living and the dead is razor thin. Hollow Ridge is tucked away in the Appalachian Mountains, a jagged scar in the landscape where the earth seems to split open. Getting there wasn't easy. The narrow road was overgrown and pockmarked with potholes, and our GPS lost signal halfway up the mountain. By the time we arrived at the trailhead, the sun was sinking below the horizon, casting the forest in shades of gold and shadow. "This place is creepy," Lily said, shivering as we unloaded our gear. "Perfect for the podcast, right?" I teased, though I couldn't ignore the knot forming in my stomach. The air felt heavier here, the quiet too complete. We set off down the trail, our flashlights cutting through the gathering darkness. The trees loomed overhead, their branches like skeletal hands reaching for the sky. Somewhere in the distance, a crow cawed, the sound harsh and lonely. The ridge itself came into view an hour later, a sheer drop into a dark, rocky canyon. The path narrowed dangerously as we approached, forcing us to walk single file. At the edge of the gorge, we set up camp. The plan was simple: record an episode of the podcast, listen for the scream, and leave by sunrise. But the ridge had other plans. We started recording just after 10 p.m., the microphone picking up the ambient sounds of the forest. Lily narrated the legend of the Wailing Girl, her voice steady and confident despite the eerie atmosphere. "They say she fell to her death in 1883, Lily explained. Some claim she was pushed, others say she jumped. Either way, her scream is said to echo through the gorge at midnight, a cry so agonizing it drives those who hear it mad." "Do people really believe that?" I asked, half laughing to mask my nerves. Lily shrugged. "Enough to keep this place deserted." As we talked, the wind picked up, whistling through the gorge like a mournful sigh. Then came the first warning, a low, guttural sound from somewhere deep in the canyon. It wasn't the scream we'd come for, it was something else, something alive. "What was that?" Lily whispered, her eyes wide. I didn't answer. I couldn't. By 11 p.m., the air had turned icy. Our fire sputtered, casting flickering shadows against the cliff face. The strange sound from the canyon had faded, but the unease lingered. "We should check the recorder," Lily suggested, pulling out her laptop. She plugged in the microphone and scrolled through the audio file, her brow furrowing. "There's something here," she muttered, cranking up the volume. Through the static came faint whispers, too low to make out words. Then, unmistakably, we heard it, a girl's voice, faint and trembling. "Help me." Lily froze, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. "That wasn't us, right?" Before I could answer, the whispering grew louder, overlapping voices that seemed to come from everywhere at once. My chest tightened, my skin crawling with the sensation of being watched. "Maybe we should leave," I said, trying to sound calm. Lily shook her head. "Not yet. We need to know." At exactly midnight, it happened. The scream tore through the air, a sound so raw and visceral, it felt like it was ripping through my very soul. It wasn't just loud. It was unbearable, the kind of noise that made your ears ache and your heart race. Lily clapped her hands over her ears, doubling over as the sound echoed through the gorge. I fell to my knees, my flashlight rolling away as I fought to catch my breath. The scream wasn't just something you heard, it was something you felt, vibrating through your bones like a shockwave. Then, as suddenly as it started, it stopped. "Did you get that?" I croaked, my throat raw. Lily didn't answer. She was staring at something behind me, her face pale as death. The Scream of Hollow Ridge, Part 2. I turned slowly, my heart pounding. At the edge of the ridge stood a figure, barefoot, her white dress tattered and stained. Her hair hung in dark, matted strands over her face, and her head tilted unnaturally to the side, as if her neck were broken. "Do you see her?" Lily whispered, her voice trembling. The figure didn't move, but I could feel her gaze, cold and piercing, even through the veil of hair. My instincts screamed at me to run, but my legs refused to obey. Then she stepped closer. We bolted, our flashlights swinging wildly as we ran back toward the trailhead. The forest closed in around us, the trees seeming to twist and stretch as the path narrowed. The scream echoed again, closer this time, followed by the sound of footsteps, light, quick, and far too close. "She's following us," Lily gasped, glancing over her shoulder. I didn't dare look back. The trail blurred as adrenaline surged through me, my breath coming in ragged gasps. But no matter how fast we ran, the footsteps kept pace, growing louder, closer. Then the ground gave way beneath me. I tumbled down a steep embankment, the world spinning in a blur of dirt and branches. I landed hard, the air knocked from my lungs. Above me, the trees seemed impossibly far away, their branches blocking out the stars. "Anna!" Lily called, her voice distant. "I'm okay," I shouted, though I wasn't sure it was true. As I stood, wincing at the sharp pain in my side, I realized I wasn't alone. The cave entrance loomed behind me, its darkness yawning like an open mouth. From within came a faint sound, a girl's sobbing. "Help me," the voice whispered, weak and broken. Every rational thought told me to stay away, but something pulled me forward. The air grew colder as I stepped inside, the sobbing growing louder. At the back of the cave, I saw her. She sat huddled against the wall, her arms wrapped around her knees. Her dress was torn and blood-stained, her bare feet caked with mud. When she looked up, I saw her face, pale and gaunt, her eyes sunken but burning with a desperate intensity. "Please," she whispered, reaching out with trembling hands. "Help me." "What happened to you?" I asked, my voice shaking. "They took me," she said, her voice cracking. "They won't let me go." Before I could ask who they were, the girl's expression changed. Her eyes widened, her mouth opening in a silent scream. "They're here," she whispered, her gaze fixed on something behind me. I turned, my flashlight flickering as the temperature plummeted. The shadows at the cave entrance seemed to move, shifting and coalescing into something solid. They weren't human, tall and thin. Their bodies were like living darkness, their faces featureless voids. They moved with unnatural speed, closing the distance between us in seconds. The girl screamed, a high, keening wail that shook the cave walls, and the shadows recoiled, retreating momentarily before pressing forward again. "Run," she shouted, shoving me toward the entrance. I didn't need to be told twice. I scrambled out of the cave and back up the embankment, my hands and knees scraped raw. Lily was waiting at the top, her face a mask of terror. "What the hell was that?" she asked, pulling me to my feet. "We need to go," I gasped, dragging her toward the trail. The forest seemed alive now, the trees groaning and shifting as the shadows pursued us. The scream echoed again, louder and closer, followed by the girl's voice. "Don't stop! Don't look back!" We reached the car just as the shadows closed in. Lily fumbled with the keys, her hands shaking so badly she dropped them twice. The shadows loomed at the edge of the clearing, their forms twisting and writhing as if held back by an invisible barrier. "Hurry!" I shouted, pounding on the car door. Finally, the engine roared to life, and we sped down the overgrown road, the headlights slicing through the darkness. The scream followed us, fading only when we crossed the threshold of the forest. We didn't stop driving until we reached a motel miles away. Neither of us slept that night. We never went back to Hollow Ridge. Lily deleted the recording from her laptop, saying some things shouldn't be heard. But the scream never left us. I hear it in my dreams, and sometimes, when the world is quiet, I swear I can feel the shadows watching me. And the girl? I don't know if she escaped. But I do know one thing. Hollow Ridge isn't just haunted. It's alive. And it's hungry.